Today, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest things that separates a successful law firm owner from a not so successful law firm owner. And I'm also going to give a couple of tips on how you can copy some of the commonly practiced things that successful law firm owners do. But to do that, we first need to talk about all of the essential phases that a law firm owner is going to go through. So when you're thinking about starting a law firm, you start off at the idea phase. And what you'll notice is as we go through these phases, there are going to be some emotional up and downs that we'll talk about as well. So when you're in the idea phase, you have this idea of starting a firm. You're probably on an emotional high, but then you go through the process of trying to figure out the details, and that emotional high doesn't always stay as high, but you finally figure it out and you start the firm. So you've gone from an emotional high of the idea down a little bit, but now you started the firm, you made that social media announcement, you got your website done, and you're putting the word out there. Now you're on another emotional high. And then you go through that process where you start realizing, getting clients is not as easy as you thought it was going to be, because you got to figure out marketing, you got to figure out messaging, you got to figure out how to get people through the funnel and all of the intake process. All of that stuff starts to bring your emotional level back down a bit more. But then once you finally get into a rhythm where you're like, hey, I know we have a strategy on being able to get clients in. We know how to attract people's attention, and you figured out how to get your clients. Now you're back on another emotional high because you're like, we got this. We can figure this out. And then when you work on a few clients, you deliver excellent work, and eventually you hit this point where you now experience there are some clients you've delivered excellent work for. You've gone to court, you fought for them, you filed for them, you got them exactly what they wanted. But now you've experienced clients who aren't actually paying their bills. And now you go through this another emotional low where you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get clients to pay their bills? How do we get caught up on the people who are behind? And how do we start putting in processes in place so that we're not working with people who aren't going to pay their bills? Where you do things like you collect upfront, or you start raising your retainer fee, or you start raising the amount that they need to hold in trust. You start figuring all that out. Now you're back on another emotional high because you've solved this problem, or you've come up with a solution on how you're going to minimize this from being a problem in the future. And now you going through this phase where you're like, hey, we have the potential to grow more, and this is more work than one person or for two people to do. So now you're looking and saying, how do we start to bring on staff? Because if we have more people, that means we can actually achieve more, we can achieve higher goals, and you as the owner of the law firm won't have to work as hard as you have been in the past. And so you go through that process of, hey, we're excited again because we're growing, we're bringing on staff, and then you go through another emotional roller coaster because now you got to figure out how to pay this staff you just hired. Because you hit that feeling where payday comes around, now you got to start thinking about things like, is there enough money in the bank account? And then you also start thinking about, well, did they even work hard enough to earn their paycheck? Like, what did they do to actually help the firm get into a place where we can now cover their salaries? And they want to get raises or they want bonuses. Now you got to figure out all of these different things around how do we structure this? How do we manage this? Which can be an emotional low or an emotional downturn for a lot of law firm owners. But eventually you figure out how to manage that. You get to a place where you're like, all right, we've gone through all of these cycles, and now we've gotten to a place where we finally feel like we've started to figure things out and things are clicking and moving in the right direction. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be any other in the events and roller coasters that happen. There are going to be other things that do happen that go up and down, but you kind of feel a bit more confident because you've been through enough of the emotional roller coaster to kind of know how to move forward. Now, here's the thing, but the difference between successful law firm owners and not so successful law firm owners is that both of them will go through this up and down emotional roller coaster. But the key difference for a successful law firm owner is they've realized how to not make decisions in the emotional lows or the emotional highs, because they figured out how do they stay kind of emotionally even and make their decisions in the emotional stable place. Now, there's a couple of things that successful law firms do to be able to bring themselves up from the emotional lows and to bring themselves down from the emotional highs to make the best decision moving forward. And a couple of ways that they do it is they know their numbers, their targets, and they get objective opinions. So let's break down the first part of that. When you think about the numbers, there are so many different numbers that you can monitor, you can look at. But one of the key areas that I tend to tell people is, let's think about your financial numbers. And here are a couple of financial numbers that I think every law firm owner should be monitoring and keeping in mind. The first one we're going to look at is the revenue, then expenses, and then we want to look at cash in versus cash out, and then finally cash on hand. So let's break it down a little bit more. When it comes down to your revenue, there are a couple of ways that you can look at the revenue. One of the ways you can look at the revenue is just total revenue. Like, how much revenue are we bringing on average on a monthly basis? How much are we bringing in like per quarter or per year? You should know what this number is. And this shouldn't be a number that you kind of guess on. This should be something you are aware of. And you can break it down even further where you look at, well, what's our revenue by case types? What types of cases are actually bringing the money in? And then you can also look at it revenue by staff member, like which staff members are actually doing the legal work to bring money in. By understanding this, it will start to give you an objective opinion about what's happening, what is bringing the money in, and how the money is coming in. And then you want to look at your expenses. Now, expenses can be broken down into a number of different ways. The first thing I tell people is you want to understand what are your average total expenses on a monthly basis. Like, about how much are you spending in total on a monthly basis? And then we can break it down into things like, what are your mandatory expenses? These are the things that you have to spend money on if you are going to be able to deliver your legal services to your clients. This might be the staffing costs. This may be the software that is essential to you interacting with your clients. Now, it may not necessarily include all of the software you use in the background or all of the software you use to make the organization more efficient. It is just the software that you use to actually interact with your clients. And then you're looking at things like your banking and your service fees, those type of things that you gotta pay those if you're gonna collect money from your clients. And when you look at those mandatory essential expenses, you can look at that in one bucket. And then the next bucket will be all the other things that you're spending money on. So all of the non-client facing type expenses, all of your operating costs, like the software you use to manage the training manuals, or your Slack or your Teams, all those types of things that you use to operate the firm in the background. Also, your administrative staff, the ones that aren't necessarily dealing directly with clients. And you also look at things that like your benefits. A lot of firms may have a vehicle as an expense for the partners or the owners of the firm, which aren't necessarily essential for you doing the job, but there's no problem at all as long as you've planned for that in your numbers. It makes perfect sense. And so when you look at your expenses in that way, the mandatory expenses, the things we have to do to provide the legal service, and the other operating expenses, it starts to give you a better perspective on, hey, if we ever needed to make an adjustment, or we needed to cut back on something, or we needed to tweak something, by breaking it into those two buckets, you kind of have a head start on knowing where to look for opportunities. And then when we get down to cash in and cash out, the main thing you want to understand is how much cash are you bringing in? Because a lot of times, law firms will look at all of the legal work that they're doing and just assume that all of that money is coming in. But you really want to have a process for, are you actually collecting on the work that you are performing? Like, really look at that number. And then you also want to look at your cash out. Like, how much cash is going out the door? A lot of times it will match what your expenses are, but it'll also include things like, owner's draws, or it include payments to loans that you are making. You want to look at that. And the big thing that you want to understand about the cash in versus the cash out is going to be really the timing. That is one of the very, very critical things that successful law firm owners manage. So here's a framework that I usually tell people is, when it comes down to cash going out the door, a lot of time your biggest expenses are going to be things like your payroll, your rent, and your credit card payments. So when you're thinking about that, the question you always want to ask yourself is there a way that we can avoid all of those payments coming out at the same time? For example, in week 1, if you got to pay your rent comes out in week 1, week 2, payroll hits, week 3, credit card payment gets paid, week 4, you got payroll again. By separating those major cash outflows, what you do is you take some of the pressure off yourself as the owner. Because when I've seen a lot of firms that are struggling, or a lot of firms that go through this constant cycle of desperate for cash, when you look at it, a lot of times they're paying their big expenses at the same time, meaning like they're paying their rent and their payroll in the same week. And if you can separate those two and adjust the timing a little bit, or maybe they're paying their credit card payment as soon as their payroll is due. And if you're paying both in the same time, it's probably gonna put you in more financial pressure than you actually want to be in. So consider kind of staggering the timing of cash going out, and then also making sure that you are following up to collect on the money that your clients owe you. And then the last one I want to talk about is cash on hand. Now, one of the ways that you can look at cash on hand is to ask yourself, how many weeks worth of cash do we have? You can look at it this way. If you already know how much cash goes out an entire month, you can kind of estimate about how much cash goes out the door on a weekly basis. Well, if you know what your cash on hand is, you can just divide those two numbers and say, hey, if we have this amount of cash on hand, if nothing else changed, we could survive for about 2 weeks, or we could survive for about 3 weeks, or we could survive for about a month. Well, when you look at it that way, one of the things that you can develop is a strategy to say, hey, how do we build that cash cushion a little bit more to take some of the financial pressure off of the decisions that you need to make? Because at the end of the day, we all have to understand that money is an emotional topic no matter who you are. And when it's time for a lot of cash to go out the door, your emotions tend to go down a little bit. But when there's cash actually on hand, or when there's cash coming in, it tends to help you not hit those downward slumps when it comes down to the money side of your firm. Now, the second factor that successful law firms tend to do very well is they manage their targets. Now, there is a ton of stuff we can say about targets, but for the sake of time, I'm going to abbreviate it, and we're also going to include some links in the comments so you can actually click on those links and you can see more of the long form videos and discussions we've talked about with targets. But a couple of ways you want to look at targets. You want to look at targets for, you want to have a budget. I would say work with your bookkeeper, your accountant, or your CFO to get a budget for your firm. That way you kind of understand where your revenue needs to be, where your expenses need to be by category. Because if you have a roadmap for how things should look, it's going to help you a lot more to get more objective about what is happening and what phase you are in your law firm. The other thing you want to look at are going to be KPIs, and you want to look at your goals. So in different ways. You want to set financial KPIs, which we talked about some of those, but you also want to set operational goals and operational targets for your staff. You want to have targets for your legal staff. You want to have targets for your sales team, your marketing team. You also want to have targets and KPIs for your non-legal team, like the administrative staff. Now, in the resource we've included in the link, we actually walk through a model of some KPIs for your legal staff, your sales, your marketing, and even your administrative staff, because they should have KPIs as well. And in the resource, we walk through some of that, so you can click on that. Now, the last piece that I want to talk about that successful law firm owners do is going to be around the area of objective opinions. See, this is where successful law firms tend to rely on either their accountant or their fractional CFO or a coaching program or mentor, and also peers. But here's the key factor. You want to deal with people who understand what your goal is and they understand how your firm operates. Because if you're working with an accountant, a coach, a mentor, or you're talking to a peer who has no idea what your goal is or has no idea how your firm actually operates, chances are you're not going to get the best advice from them. They're probably not going to give you the opinion that you need to stay objective and to continue moving towards the goal of your interest. And this is something that I see with a lot of law firms when they watch a YouTube video or they go to a conference and they're like, this person on stage said I should be doing X, Y, and Z. And I always ask, does that person understand what your goal is? And do they understand or have any context on how your firm operates? If someone is giving you advice and they don't understand those two things, you probably should take their advice as general guidance, but don't take it as specific advice for your firm and what actions you should take if they don't understand your goals and some context on your firm. So as you start to think about those three factors, one of the things you want to do is start asking yourself, how is my law firm doing when it comes down to understanding our numbers, setting targets, and getting objective opinions that are actually relevant to your firm's goals? Because if you are implementing those three factors, what it does, it allows you, as you're going through that emotional roller coaster of the decisions and the opportunities, it allows you to bring the low lows up to the middle and the high highs back to an even playing field so that you can make smart decisions about where your business is headed. And you'll make a lot more progress towards your goals and your objectives when you do that. Now, if you like this content and you think this has been great, you should definitely go over to Facebook and join the Law Firm and Finance Facebook group, because in that group, we're going to be doing more videos like this where we share highlights and clips. We're also going to be sharing more of the resources and the tools. Like we talked about the KPIs, there are going to be some resources that we offer for free to the people who are in the group. Now you can go to our website and you can buy the resources, or you can join the group and we'll be releasing some of those resources for free just for the people who are in the group. So if you like it, hit the subscribe where you are and then head over to Facebook and join the Law Firm plus Finance Facebook group. Thanks for tuning in.